History and has taught at the University of Calcutta. He has served as editor, editorial pages, The Telegraph. Dr. Hari Vasudevan is a specialist in Russian and European history and Indo-Russian relations and a UGC emeritus professor at the Department of History. His research interests include democracy and development in India and Europe. Over to you, sir.
This is fine? Good. Yes, great. So Rudrangshu says Nehru empties halls. Well, it's a heavy dose for the afternoon, and I think we've been listening to something very stimulating, and it's been a great pleasure to have listened from the sides to our last panelists. But I hope you'll enjoy what we're going to be talking about this afternoon as well, which is, or in the next session, which is Rudrangshu Mukherjee's new biography on Nehru. Rudrangshu Mukherjee is not simply a chancellor and not simply a professor of Calcutta University. I think what's very important is that somewhere he's attempted, and it's a very rare thing in India, to bridge a gap that exists between the world of intellectuals and and public writing. Normally, with the exception of Ram Guha, perhaps, and perhaps now Manu Pillai, it's very rare to have people who keep an eye on academic debates and discussions, and at the same time attempt to go one step further. Dr. Mukherjee has, over, I think, a very creative professional life, attempted to do both. Both as a person who was associated with the Telegraph in the city, but even more as a person who's written books which people have read, and he has wanted them to read it, not simply a small coterie of intellectuals who are concerned with certain important debates. That doesn't mean that he hasn't contributed to debates as well. His book on Nehru is really a testimony to many of these diverse interests of his. Like many short things, it packs a punch which is far, far above the number of pages that it fits into. So I think it's a remarkable achievement that he's been able to cover as much as he's been able to cover, both in terms of depth as well as in terms of the life space of one of India's most kind of debated leaders today, because so much is said and so much is contested about the figure of India's first Prime Minister, and has been especially over the course of the past 10 years or so. What I would like to begin this session with, Rudrangshu, is really to ask you, there are two sides to you, really. I mean, you've always taken an interest in academic debate. I mean, you've somewhere stood there with the Cambridge School and problems with it, subaltern studies, all sorts of different debates. When you wrote a book like this, how did you feel you were going to bring the two sides of your interest together? And how do you think you've done it? That gives you a lot of space to, as it were, wander into the book a little bit and introduce the people with us to it.
So what I'd like to begin by saying is that I think it'll be a bit of an overstatement to say this is a biography, because I don't think you can write a biography of Nehru in 35,000 words, which is what the length of this book is. This book actually is a part of a series that Oxford University Press is doing globally. It's called the Oxford Short Introductions. This is for India. It's the Oxford Short Introduction, Oxford India Short Introduction. So it looks at themes. The series aims to look at themes, figures, etc., and then write a very short account of it, which is accessible to a very wide group of people, to a very wide audience. In fact, to more generally to a non-specialist audience. So that is really the remit of the book. I hope one day, using this book as a kind of dry run, to be able to write a biography, a proper biography of Nehru at some length. So to come to your question, specific question, Hari, first, both as a teacher of history and somebody who attempts to write history as well, I have never considered history to be simply an academic discipline. I do see it as an academic discipline, and I also teach it as an academic discipline. But I think the calling of history, or CLIO, if you like, has a much wider appeal. And it is the responsibility of historians who are trying to write history to appeal or write for that wider audience. I often say that history is actually a public discipline. It's one of those disciplines in the humanities which is a public discipline because it plays a role in making what George Bernard Shaw called the intelligent layman aware of some things that are actually not in the wider general domain. So that's what made me write this book. And of course, I feel in today's India, and I know I'm treading into very contentious territory here, there's a lot of abuse and a lot of misinformation about Nehru that is being spread through the social media, through political propaganda, etc. And I thought it was necessary to place Nehru in his time, in the perspective, and give a reading of Nehru's life which was not abusive or not even used for the reasons of propaganda. A way a historian would look at a very important figure who made the transition from being an ordinary foot soldier of the Indian national movement and then becoming India's first prime minister through, let's admit that, a lot of personal sacrifice. He was born with more than a silver spoon in his mouth, the son of a very, very rich father. His house had a private swimming pool, a private tennis court. He went to Harrow and Trinity College, Cambridge. And in his own words, when he came back in 1912, after becoming a barrister at law from Lincoln's Inn and having done a natural sciences tripos from Cambridge, he says he returned to India with the attitudes of a westernized prig, an upper-class westernized prig. I think that's the phrase that he used to describe himself. And from there, to make the journey, to be one of Gandhi's followers, somebody who spent nearly 1,200 days in prison, in British prisons because of his involvement in the Indian national movement, and then to become a somewhat charismatic prime minister as well. It's quite a journey, and I think there is a story to be told there, and that's the story I try and capture. This is not to say that Nehru is some kind of an infallible figure who didn't have faults or didn't falter in this journey, didn't flounder in this journey. He did. And there is enough room for criticism of Nehru, some of his policies that he undertook, some of the steps that he took, etc. But nonetheless, I think it's a very, very significant journey, and he's a very significant, almost, titanic individual.
Yeah, let's just follow a couple of the points that you made, though. First and foremost, there's this point about the minefield that you have to tread in making statements about the person. But there's also something else, which is that somewhere, even if you're going to write a short piece, even if you're writing an introduction, I notice the actual bibliography indicates a very wide range of reading at the highest level that you attempted to give a lay public. Okay, somewhere or another, there's a lot that has been thought about the 20s and the 30s. There's a lot that's been thought about the partition, all of which somewhere has to be digested if you're attempting to be fair to the lay of land of the history as a discipline, as opposed to perhaps even history as a public discipline. Okay, I mean there's so much that's been written about various things. So I mean, for instance, the nature, for instance, of the isolation of the Congress when it came to a large number of social issues, which you've actually touched here and there, and the virtual impossibility in many ways of a leader of the Congress, or even an emerging leader of the Congress, except in extremely broad lines, to understand the character of this isolation. I mean, these are things which have become crucial to the debates that hold India together at the moment and actually divide us as well. These issues, when contending with them, how do you think your narrative, I mean, the way in which you draw the man through this, manages to engage with some of these crucial debates? I mean, if you would take one or two, and the one I suggested especially, which clearly refers to Dalits and other such, marginalized communities.
No, before the marginalized communities, so the first isolation that Nehru feels within the Congress, not just Congress as the other actors in the field, but within the Congress, Nehru is a very isolated figure. There is a period in his life when he's a very isolated figure, alienated from Gandhi, alienated from the other important Congress leaders, those that he and his friend and comrade Subhash Chandra Bose described as though it was a Bose phrase, actually, which Nehru adopted, the old guard. Gandhi's lieutenants, Rajagopalachari, Vallabhbhai Patel, Rajendra Prasad, Govinda Ballabh Pant, and so on and so forth. So Nehru, at one point in his life, is completely isolated from this, as I said, from Gandhi and his principal lieutenant. This is around the year 1936, when he has just returned from Europe. It's also a period of tremendous personal bereavement for him. He has just lost his wife after a very prolonged illness. He's also written his first book, which is dedicated to his wife. And the European experience, he has been going to Europe off and on because of his wife's illness from 1933 to 1935. And the exposure to Europe and all that he read and experienced in Europe, the rise of fascism, the rise of socialism, the rise of working class movements, the experience of unemployment, inflation, and so on that Europe was going through in the early 1930s, has made Nehru a convinced and a committed socialist. And much to his surprise and somewhat to his reluctance as well, Gandhi makes him the Congress president in 1936 for a second time. He was the first president in 1929. Perhaps he was the youngest person to be made a president in 1929 in the Lahore Congress, where he proposes and gets through the Purna Swaraj, the complete independence resolution. But 1936 is a little different because the Government of India Act is just about to be passed. It's been drafted. And Nehru stands, I think the session is in Lucknow, and he stands there, and if I'm not mistaken, for the first and the only time in the history of the Congress, Congress president stands to give his address and addresses the gathering of Congress workers with a single phrase, comrades, he says. He doesn't say Jai Hind or whatever, Vande Mataram, whatever other standard ways that Congress people greeted each other. He says comrades. And then, very surprisingly, for many people in Calcutta who misunderstand or misrepresent the relationship between between Nehru and Bose, the second paragraph of that speech actually is about Bose himself, who is being held without trial. And he says, this is what the British government actually is like. They are holding one of our workers, one of our comrades without trial. And then he goes on. He goes on to say, and this is the striking part of that address, what is to be the future of India? He says, India has no future without economic equality. Just political independence would be an empty, substanceless achievement. So, and only way India can achieve economic equality is through socialism and through planning by following the Soviet model. And he says the Congress should adopt socialism as one of its agenda as it moves towards independence. Now, this, as was to be expected in 1936, creates a complete furor within and without the Congress. I mean, outside the Congress, the capitalist class led by Birla and others, they accuse Nehru of actually being an agent of Moscow. And they write to Gandhi saying, Birla, I think, writes to Gandhi to say that you have to tame this disciple of yours. And 7 members of the 12-member working committee, led by Vallabhbhai Patel, resign. They say that this is not the president that we can work with because he has completely upset all that we have been trying to work for since the Congress was established. And they write to Gandhi and they say, this is a very unruly son of yours and we can't work with him. So Gandhi says, Gandhi is, in his characteristic manner, he says, if you can't work with him, resign. And they all resign, and Gandhi writes to Nehru to say that they have resigned at my advice. So you shouldn't think that I have nothing to do with it. I'm also being upfront with you. That's the kind of relationship Gandhi and Nehru had. They never hid their differences from each other, to a point to which we should come back at some point, if you like. Nehru writes back to Gandhi, and he says, it's a very interesting letter. He says, if I were a hayaya, he writes that in Hindi, a man with dignity, I would resign as the president. But it so happens I'm a behaya. I'm a man without dignity, so I'm not going to resign. The second reason why I'm not going to resign is that I'm not a quitter. I accepted this position of Congress president, and I articulated what are my firmly held views at this point of time, and we have to find ways of working together, and I cannot leave the Congress or the Congress presidency at this point of time. So some kind of rapprochement is worked out, and they withdraw their resignations and come back to the working committee. And after the first meeting of the working committee, gloating, Vallabhbhai Patel writes to Gandhi to say, working with Jawaharlal is like a dream. It's like old times. So, but Nehru is completely out of tune with this lot. And this alienation is aggravated by the fact that when it comes to office acceptance, after the election results are announced in late 1936, 1937, Nehru is against office acceptance. And the old guard, but led by Raja Gopalachari and Vallabhbhai Patel, they want office acceptance. And Nehru, of course, is completely defeated. He's outvoted in the working committee on the office acceptance vote. And Congress goes on for the first time to taste power. And we don't know if that taste was altogether good for the Congress.
Can I just take that in two directions? See, the last point that you make concerning the acceptance of power at that time, later Nehru was to justify in Discovery of India as the first engagement between people and power in a genuine manner. There's a big difference between the Congress governments and any other government that had existed in the provinces, etc. So somehow he manages to turn this, as you say, this defeat into something else. I mean, it's something that clearly must have struck him as he begins to engage with the process itself. But that leads me to another issue, which is that and it figures through the book, that's why I point to it. There's this notion of an ideology. And in fact, Nehru is associated with an ideology in a way in which practically no other individual member of the Congress is really associated with an ideology. So there's a notion that he stands for a block of ideas. Somewhere through the book, both before he's prime minister and after he's prime minister, you have accepted this notion of a block of ideas. Now, clearly, since there were communists already in India, and the communists were happily following the Comintern line and moving with it, etc., there is one understanding of what a block of ideas can be. I mean, how it could figure. And there are all sorts of things that are being generated by the Comintern indicating what socialism is and what socialism should be. Now, in this, how do you see Nehru, as it were, maneuvering forward? I mean, what is this ideology that really he has been then and even now is associated with?
Yeah, I think there's a great deal of ambivalence in Nehru regarding this ideology. He's a socialist. And the ambivalence was, I mean, almost prophetically and appositely summed up by Subhash Bose, who once wrote, I forget to who, maybe to his nephew Amyanath Bose. He writes in a letter, he says, Jawaharlal's heart, Jawaharlal's head is with socialism. Jawaharlal's heart is with Gandhi. So there are these twin pulls in two opposite directions in Nehru. So even though he is a committed socialist, he cannot reconcile himself with violence, which is associated with the Russian Revolution and much that is happening in Russia, which you know much better than I do or anybody else does in this city, in the 1920s, in the 1930s. I mean, there's a letter to Vijayalakshmi Pandit written around 1937 or so on, where he notes what is happening in the Bukharin trials, and he is disapproving of what is going on. So even though he's a socialist and he accepts the Soviet planning model, the political side of socialism, he is not quite reconciled to. And so that ideology is, as I said, it's pulling in two ways. It's a bit of a mishmash. He's a socialist, but he's not a communist, if such a contradiction can be formulated. He is that. And then, of course, the second thing that happens, and this ties up because you mentioned Discovery of India, that long spell in prison, which is his longest spell, 1942 to the beginning of 1945, nearly the end of the Second World War, which is his longest spell in prison, and most of it is spent in isolation, leads him to see, in the words of his biographer S. Gopal, leads him to see nationalism as a kind of emotional cradle. And the product of that, the outcome of that is the discovery of India, which he prefaces with the quote from Shakespeare's sonnet number 30, when to the sessions of sweet silent thought, I summon up remembrance of things past. So silent thought, he's recognizing his isolation in the prison cell, and all that he can do at that point of time is to fall back on the past. And that nationalism comes to lace his socialism as well. So I think there are layers to Nehru. It is, as you say, a block of ideas rather than one monolithic idea that dominates his life. But there are some running themes. One, and this is very prominent once he becomes prime minister, that India must have its place in the world. And that India is a part of the Indian independence, and the making of an independent Indian republic is a part of a broader Afro-Asian movement, which is what leads him to non-alignment during the Cold War, which is what leads to Bandung, and, and for him, of course, very devastatingly, to hold out a hand towards China, because he sees India and China as the makers of an Asian future. So, which is repudiated, of course, in many ways by the Chinese for very complicated reasons, part of which was also India's fault. But Nehru's ideology has many, many different and contradictory strands to it. So I don't see one can actually paint Nehru in a monochrome.
Yeah, but let's just take that last point you're making, though. Do you think, as a result, that given these uncertainties, this refusal to be pinned down on a number of issues, and the issues were going to become extremely important when it comes to the implementation of the Constitution and the establishment of a government, a polity, that Nehru actually felt much more comfortable dealing with the world at large rather than handling the nitty-gritty of politics. There's a famous statement by Patel when he's discussing Nehru with Nehru and Mountbatten, that he says that, they will essentially continue their conversation and Mountbatten will be child's play in Nehru's hands. It is we who will actually conduct the revolution which will take place in India. It's quoted by, I think, Patrick French from a correspondence noting. Do you think actually he was almost coming from Harrow and Cambridge, as it were, that he was happier somewhere thinking about a large picture rather than actually dealing with those peasants that he'd had to interact with over the...
It's very funny when the first Jawaharlal Nehru Memorial Lecture at Trinity College, Cambridge, to which Mountbatten was the speaker, Mountbatten's first uttered sentence was, "Harrow and Trinity, he was one of us." So, yes, there was an aspect of Nehru that was more comfortable with PLUs, if you like. But there were some very strong commitments that Nehru has. I do not completely agree that he was not concerned with the nitty-gritties of constitution making and the nitty-gritty of politics. No, even the implementation. If you read the constitutional debates, he is actually pushing through universal adult franchise, right? He is actually planning and implementing that first general election, 1952, which is, in terms of just implementation, was a colossal achievement. And his immediate southpaw, if you like, the man who is implementing it according to his wishes is actually a Bengali civil servant, ICS Sukumar Sen, who was Chief Secretary of Bengal, who at the special request of Nehru, Bidhan Roy released so that he could become India's first election commissioner. So it's a mammoth task. And also it's very interesting, when the 52 elections are done, he is actually also telling Sukumar Sen, keep those ballot boxes because we will need them again in 4 years' time. So he's looking forward already to India becoming a functioning democracy. So there's a very strong commitment to that, as is a very strong commitment that India should be a nation state that will be indifferent to religion. It will not be committed to any one religious belief or any one religious ideology. And this is his first battle, in fact, as Prime Minister. He's battling the first President of India, and he's also battling a man who by now is quite ill and unwell, Vallabhbhai Patel. So there are these firm commitments that he also has, which are not to do with the world, but it also to do with India as well.
So let me then reverse the way I would see it, or the way you're seeing it. If in fact on the one hand, and this is said frequently today, he was a very wobbly, poetic, vague kind of individual who had some good notions, but when it came to hard matters, finally it had to be Patel and others who would do the job. Okay? Now, that can be read at one level in a very negative manner, which is that here you're dealing with a highly impractical person who was happy to make big speeches at Bandung and elsewhere, and kind of hobnob with the best in the world. But it can also be thought of as something else, which is that the people who actually became practical were the people who actually also antagonized and created a series of problems that the Congress would have to live with almost eternally, which is that ultimately various specific decisions which did not always accord with, say, a principle or a high point of morality would be something that they would simply have to cut the Gordian knot on and make a decision with and actually antagonize people with. Nehru was able continuously to create for the Congress and somewhere for India, at a crucial time in its history, a larger dimension which, even if it was vague, at least resonated with practically everything that the Congress had been working with, and with an appeal to poverty, to the poor, to a large inclusive and involvement of India's people. Now, this actually is the great contribution. And it was a contribution which only a person who's isolated in the way in which you related. And I think the one major point which stretches throughout this short account is this isolation. It keeps on coming up. It comes up in the late 1900s, it comes up in the, 1910s, it comes up in the 1920s, it comes up in the 1930s. It's always there, and it's certainly there after 1950, after all these people have begun to die as well. So as India's Prime Minister, the same thing. So in a sense, it was something which is very important, that one should not be part of the skullduggery of the entire process, but at the same time be involved in it. I mean, would you agree that that is something?
I would tend to agree with it, except that when you say that, he left the implementation to people like Patel. Patel was dead by 1950. People tend to forget this. Nehru was prime minister for 14 more years. So he actually was prime minister without Patel for the larger period of his premiership. This is often not neglected, it's often not noted when people say, oh, Patel did the donkey work or got his hands dirty when Nehru didn't do anything. I think there's something factually wrong about it because Patel was dead by 1950. The other thing, yes, there was, I don't know who noted this. It was not S. Gopal, but somebody else, that there was an element of Hamlet in Nehru. So I don't know what the experts on Shakespeare, Shukanto and Shupriya think about this, but do we admire Hamlet or not? A part of us do admire Hamlet when we read the play. So a part of us, I think, admires Nehru as well. But we also can see his vacillation, the fact that he doesn't think that there is something called, or there can philosophically be something that is absolutely certain that can be grasped. So he actually writes in the autobiography that, the future has no written script. So I don't know what the future is going to be. And this is something that constantly haunts Nehru. Am I doing the right thing? Is this the right thing to do? But yet I have to do it, so I'm aware of the pitfalls, So there is this element in Nehru, I think, which I find very human in its fragility and frailty. But people who want India to be, quote unquote, a strong state may not actually be appreciative of that. And of course, he has no 14 brass who has his dying voice.
Since the audience has been appealed to by Rudrangshu, perhaps I should ask the audience also to come up with any questions it may have. Yes? Have one straight away.
Is there any mic around? Mala, is there any mic around?
Any other questions that I can immediately? One over here, so one over here, one over here. You have a question? Not yet, not yet.
Yes, oh, there you are. No, he has his hand up first, so let's go to him first. We'll come back to you.
Sir, you mentioned that from the very beginning, Nehru had a vision that India should be prominent in the world. From the very beginning. Is it
From the very beginning, from the beginning of his prime ministership.
from the beginning of his prime ministership? Sir, is it the genesis of Kashmir crisis that he internationalized it?
Not really. No, it is not the genesis of the Kashmir tragedy. The Kashmir tragedy has a genesis elsewhere. That is the invasion of what is today called POK by a group of tribesmen who were completely sponsored not just by the Pakistan government, but actually by British officers who were then stationed. No. Yes. Yes, but what was Nehru's position in the ENO? This is also not often noted. He said that there can be a referendum only after status quo ante has been restored. That is, the Pakistani tribesmen have pulled back to what their position was pre-15th August 1947. So this is never fulfilled. And Nehru feels, having gone to the United Nations with this condition, he feels that both Britain and America actually betrayed him and stabbed him in the back. And he writes to Mountbatten to say that this is what your people have done. And now it is becoming very clear with the latest letter that has been released by Attlee writing to the then Secretary of State of the United States of America that a division and a hostility between India and Pakistan was actually what the British government wanted. They didn't want to leave behind a united and a peaceful India. This question here.
Sir, how far is Nehru responsible for the division of the partition of the India part?
I think it will be rather simplistic to say one individual was responsible for the partition of India. Nehru was certainly implicated in the partition of India. But to say that only Nehru was responsible, I think will be a gross oversimplification of history. There were other people and other factors also that were interested in India. By the way, the entire Congress working committee of that time, with the exceptions of Mahatma Gandhi and Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan, voted for the partition.
We often hear that Churchill was a poor peacetime prime minister, and he was a very good wartime prime minister. Can we say that Nehru was a good peacetime prime minister and not so good during the war?
How do you mean? I mean, poor man only saw one war. So, if it can be called a war, I mean, these days historians don't even call it a war, they call it a skirmish. It was the latest book by, what's his name, Verma, actually says that it wasn't much of a war at all. So, yes, it was a skirmish in which not just Nehru, including some very important army generals handled badly. And there is some ground to say that Nehru was not receiving the complete information from the northeastern borders, and the position, the military position of India in the northeastern borders completely. And many of his decisions were based on this incomplete information. But he actually also fought two very successful wars. I don't approve of war for any reason, but he at least fought two very successful wars. One was in Hyderabad and the other was in Goa, which is another contradiction in Nehru's character and Nehru's career, that globally he always spoke for peace, but within India, he was not hesitant to send out his army when it suited his own political interests.
Hi, sir. My name is Raj. It's a question to any of you who can answer it. Apart from emergency from 74 to 77, did we witness a strong state, autocratic state, maybe from Nehru or Indira Gandhi's tenure? Do you think could we witness maybe if not fully autocratic, maybe democratically autocratic government, like it has happened in Turkey with Recep Erdogan, or with our neighbor like Sheikh Hasina in Bangladesh? Was the scenario because in the recent surveys, some surveys, that the faith in our democracy, the faith in democracy has eroded a bit, and people do believe that to develop faster, like the China developed in the 80s and 90s, we do need 10 years of autocratic government. So
first is, I disagree with this proposition that India needs autocracy. I think India needs more democracy, which India is not getting at the moment. And second, I don't think in any period before the emergency, the 18 months of the emergency, India saw any form of autocratic or authoritarian rule, not even under Mrs. Gandhi before 1974.
If you had to choose between what constitutes the most enduring legacy that Nehru has given this country, and if the choices were between, on the one hand, the investments that he made in education and in setting up the basis for heavy industry, and on the other hand, in creating a pluralistic vision of what this country actually stands for, which do you think has been his more enduring contribution?
You are asking, do you think, I think the you is important here, you're asking me,
Yes.
my views. Yes, certainly the pluralistic view of India and building up the pillars of a democratic polity and a democratic society. If there are two enduring legacies of Jawaharlal Nehru, in my view, these two. And they are related, actually. You can't have one without the other.
I'd like to ask, one can read a continuous idea of distributive justice in Nehru's writings and speeches. There is a large debate on his socialism and his deviation from it, but do you think he deviated from his idea of distributive justice, like equitable distribution, equality of opportunity, and move more toward production in the latter phase of his prime ministership?
So if your emphasis is on a continuous discourse on distributive justice, the answer is no. I mean, he doesn't actually engage with this idea of distributive justice to the extent and to the depth that you could say he could have or he should have. But certainly post the second plan, his emphasis shifts more towards production and the commanding heights of the economy than it does towards distributing. Because I think it was Nehru's phrase, he said, you cannot distribute poverty. So you must first increase the wealth of the nation, and then it is possible to start redistributing wealth rather than redistributing poverty.
I think that's all that we have time for. So thank you very, very much, Dr. Mukherjee.
Thanks,
Professor
Hari.
Mukherjee.
Thanks so much.
And thanks for the many excellent questions that have come from the audience. Thank you very much to the organizers. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mukherjee. Thank you, Dr. Vasudevan. As always, an honor to have you with us.
It's rickety? Okay, two heavy bodies.